I said pick it up! Get up! Get up! You've been taught how to duel, I presume, yes? First, we bow to each other. Come on now, Harry, the niceties must be observed. Dumbledore wouldn't want you to forget your manners, would he? I said bow. That's better.
Hey y'all, welcome back to another video. My name is Alexander, and in the last video, I discussed my appreciation for the dueling scene as an opener to the broad topic of dueling PvP in Elden Ring. Today, I'll be discussing what I've learned over the past few weeks, having put in over 100 hours into dueling. Now, I will disclose that I'm barely a functioning human being, let alone a pro Elden Ring duelist, so the content of this video isn't going to be the end-all, be-all for PvP advice. This also isn't going to be an all-inclusive beginner's guide to dueling in Elden Ring, although it is my aim that over the course of this video, as well as several more to come, that they can be used as and eventually condensed into a beginner's guide to dueling in PvP. That being said, let's take a journey through my PvP experience thus far, and hopefully there are some tips and tricks that are helpful for you in the future. Before getting into dueling, it is important to understand the general rules the community, by and large, abides by in duels. Firstly, upon summoning or being summoned as a duelist, both players should emote to each other. This is typically done as a simple wave or a bow. Next, some players, myself included, like to use the Physic Flask at the start of the duel. This is also the time to cast self-buffs if you have them. If both players aren't buffing, the one not buffing should wait a little bit for the other player to be ready, and if you are buffing, try not to go overboard, and allow your opponent to buff as well if they'd like to. Once everyone is ready, the duel commences. The biggest rule to duels is to not use your Crimson Tier Flask. In invasions, it's totally fine to pop a heal, but in duels, the Crimson Flask is just not used. Notice how I specifically mentioned the Crimson Flask and not healing in general. Healing is okay if it is part of your build, such as a spell, although I am iffy on the community's stance on castable heals. The most common way is to use the Crimson Bubble tier. This is put in your Physic Flask. Regen weapons like the Butchering Cleaver, Great Stars, or the Serpent God's Curved Sword are also okay, as well as Ashes of War like Prayerful Strike. These are a lot more fair than just popping your Crimson Flask if your build utilizes it. And going off script here a little bit, these are also fair because they are avoidable. You can avoid the Butchering Cleaver and you can avoid the Great Star's Mace. You can do more damage if the opponent is at, say, 35% health. The Crimson Bubble tier doesn't proc until you're at 20% health. So if you do that 35% of their health and you bring them down to 0, then their Crimson Flask doesn't really matter. So these are avoidable heals, whereas popping a flask, I understand, yeah, maybe you can go and do a jump attack or go and, poise them out of it, but the flask is just an instant heal. Castable heals are interruptible as well as something as simple as fan daggers or a throwing knife. Lastly, upon victory, it is expected that the winning duelist politely emote, aka not point down, to their losing opponent. One of the funniest things I've seen after losing was someone bowed and then they dropped a rainbow stone on my corpse before I returned. And I've adopted this myself, and when I summon in duelists, I will use rainbow stones as like grave markers to mark the death of my opponents. So if I get on a winning streak, my main academy gate looks like a Christmas tree. Overall, the takeaway here is that duels are about fair combat and pitting one build up against another. And most importantly, they're about respecting your opponent. There have been times where someone just had an amazing opener and decimated me during our fight, and I couldn't do anything but laugh and congratulate them. On the flip side, I've also been decimating other players and still paid them the respect that they deserved because they gave me a fun fight. The rules are simple. You wave or you bow, maybe you buff, maybe you use physic, then you clap cheeks without deep-throating your crimson flask, and if you win, you bow again, and if you lose, well, you're already on the ground. One of the most impactful things I've learned, which should be a no-brainer and probably is to everyone that's not me, because again, gooey smooth brain over here, is how to be more mindful of how I build my character. I won't dive too deep into stat mechanics in this video, but if you'd like to see a video about stat mechanics, let me know. Although there are several stat mechanic breakdown videos that are just wonderful, and I'll link some of them in the description below, or in the card up top if I can figure out how that works. What I do want to point out, however, is that Vigor is your best friend. I play at the 150 level, in the process of leveling another to 125 for more competitive matches, and I can't stress enough, having 60 Vigor is crucial if you enjoy being able to get your moveset out before getting one-shot by Chris Kyle with a bolt of Grand Sax. You can play around with 58 or 59 Vigor too, and using items like Crimson Amber Medallion +2 or Erdtree Favor +2, or even getting the Crimson Hood, which will give you +1 Vigor, can help you cover some of the losses of running 58 instead of 60. Aside from Vigor, being a melee build, I've learned that it is important that you are familiar with Poise breakpoints and run enough Poise to avoid your stance being broken from attacks under your chosen breakpoint. For example, I try to run a minimum of 61 Poise, which I've been told is the critical Poise breakpoint, and a minimum most melee builds should hit. I can also equip different armor and the Bullgoat Talisman to bring me up to roughly 105 Poise for better defense against those heavier weapon builds such as halberds or great swords, although running / jumping / two-handed attacks will still break my stance, so it's not the end-all be-all. Okay, so Vigor and Poise aside, but staying within the theme of defense, I find that Robustness is your most valuable status effect defensive stat, as it increases how much bleed and frostbite damage that you can withstand before being bled or frostbitten. These two status effects are, from what I've seen, the most prevalent status effects, with Madness being 3rd and Scarlet Rot being 4th. I've only ever seen one sleep-based build, besides my own, but that's another video, although I will have some clips of that build in this video. And lastly, in 100 plus hours of rune level 150 duels, I have never seen anybody use a Deathblight build, except for one guy who used Death Lightning. Now, in all fairness, he did kill me. But then again, I don't think that his entire build was revolving around Deathblight, because that was the only Deathblight spell he was using, not even Fia's Mist. I highly recommend prioritizing Robustness, as Frostbite and Bleed builds are a dime a dozen currently, so anything to defend yourself against them is most likely in your best interest. Now moving on from defense and into offense, the most valuable thing I learned here is that word that makes every business person stiff and wet: synergy. Now, when synergizing, do be careful not to sacrifice too many passive bonuses for active situational ones. A good example of this is if you were running Erdtree +2, Millicent's Prosthesis, Lord of Blood's Exaltation, and Rotten Winged Sword Insignia, the only guaranteed boost is from Erdtree +2 and half from Millicent's Prosthesis. Everything else are active buffs contingent on if you get successive swings for Millicent's Prosthesis and Rotten Winged Sword, as well as a bleed proc for the Lord of Blood. Sure, your AR would absolutely skyrocket especially if you were using the thorny cracked tier in your physic flask, but until you get those consecutive hits in, or bleed, or both, you're effectively using one, arguably two, with a Millicent talismans at the start of the fight. Now, this is potentially helpful if you're able to get the talisman's effects to activate, but also preventing you from using more reliable, passively benefiting talismans, such as Datakar's Woe. No, I'm joking, I'm just joking. Please don't use that in PvP unless you're a masochist. Jokes aside, there are tons of ways to have talismans, physic tiers, weapons, weapon arts, armor, and even consumables work well together, but be mindful that you're not leaving too many passive benefits on the cutting room floor. Okay, looking at the script and realizing I'm already on page 4 and only have 2 days to edit, this will be the last topic that I cover in this video. Range and positioning is crucial. I typically play a short range weapon build, like thrusting swords, straight swords, uchikatana, etc. So for me, range and positioning are easily life or death, but I'd actually imagine that it's equally or close to equally as important for long range weapons like greatsword or the Knight Rider glaive. Let me define what I mean by range and positioning. Range is, well, it's just that. It's managing the distance between you and your opponent so that your attacks connect and their attacks don't connect. For melee on melee, this is typically not that hard to manage relative to melee versus a caster, since spells have a much broader spectrum of ranges. If I'm running a straight sword build and my opponent is power stancing pikes, then I need to be very aware of their weapon range versus mine so that I make sure that I get hits in, whereas their attacks don't hit me. Range alone won't solve this problem, obviously, because spears are always going to be longer than straight swords, especially if you're going head to head. And that's where positioning comes into play. Positioning is just as important as range, in my opinion, as in terms of range, I will be outclassed by halberds every time if I'm using a straight sword. However, if I manage to get my halberd-wielding opponent to perform an attack, and I'm positioned where it won't hit me, but I can hit them, they're stuck in that animation for a split second, while I have the opportunity to get in a few jabs and slashes. In my experience, positioning yourself behind the opponent isn't actually always the best move either, especially if you're using R1, as sometimes you'll engage the backstab animation without actually getting the backstab attack itself, and this will cause you to be in a vulnerable state, whereas the opponent, having not actually been grabbed for the backstab, is free to add a few more holes to your glorious tarnished body. Now, if you're using Misericord, or at least have it as an option in your build, disregard that, because your criticals will obliterate if you can get them to land, but maybe parry, as that's probably a more reliable way to get in a critical. When it comes to what I've learned regarding range and positioning, the biggest thing is don't stand in front of the big weapon-wielding duelists if your weapon looks like something Bilbo Baggins uses. Be sure to utilize when your opponent is caught in an animation, like a long charging weapon art or spell cast, and get in some damage while your opponent cannot reciprocate. Lastly, and most importantly, is to know the range of your weapons and spells and the movesets of your weapons. For melee weapons, be sure to test out all of the moves in your arsenal, such as running R2s or stealth R1s, L1s too for power stancers, jumping attacks, etc. you should be familiar with each of the moves in your arsenal, as well as what kind of range each of them have. You don't have to get into the nitty-gritty details for range if you don't want to, but it is helpful to know the range of your weapons relative to other weapons in the same weapon class. For example, say I'm using the Chrightt thrusting sword, but I want to swap to the Ant Spur rapier. For the innate Scarlet Rot buildup maybe. Well, the moveset is almost identical. I think for this example the R2 or running R2 is different, but I might be wrong. But when I equip the Ant Spur, I noticed that the thing is itty bitty compared to the Chrightt thrusting sword, so my attack range will be affected by this. As an inverse example, say I'm power stancing the Uchi Katana, but then I swap to power stancing the Nagakiba instead. Well, now I've just gained range, and quite a bit of it. So if I do a stealth L1, the scissor swipe attack that I do has a lot more range, and I don't have to be as close to my opponent to get it off. Character positioning and character range are really important things to be aware of, and knowing the moveset of your chosen weapons and the range of the different moves within that moveset can absolutely make the difference in a duel, and I highly recommend familiarizing yourself with them if you haven't already for your current build, or maybe explore a new build with new weapons and spells. I'm going off script here a little bit, so forgive me if this is a little choppy, but one thing that I did want to point out is that with the knowing your weapon range, that it is always going to be beneficial if you are familiar with the weapon that your opponent is using, such as, like for me, I was doing a greatsword build prior to doing a thrusting sword, katana, straight sword, like the Inky Dinky Bilbo Baggins weapons. So basically, like, I know the range relatively of the greatsword, so I'm familiar with that. So when I fight it, I still get my shit wrecked all the time, but it's still helpful for me to know that information. I think that as you explore more builds, especially more variety in your builds, or just fight more people and, go and kind of get a better understanding, maybe for like the Vikes War Spear or something like that, then, that's going to be helpful for you as well. But what I want to emphasize is that, you don't necessarily have to know every, weapon's range. It's perfectly okay if you just have a really solid understanding of your weapon range, because when you think about positioning as the kind of addition to range, knowing your weapon range and being able to position yourself around the player, especially if they're using something like the fingerprint shield or just any great shield, to be honest, besides maybe the jelly shield, that's going to be infinitely more helpful than memorizing the range for every weapon. You'll just kind of instinctively get to recognize the weapon range of your opponent over time. That's perfectly normal, but definitely familiarize yourself with your weapon set from the get-go, because you'll definitely have an advantage as you're practicing positioning, and I think that's really nice. I didn't cover spells that much in this video, as I need to do some more testing with the sorcerer or incantation build to comfortably give advice on the matter, but I will be doing that in a future video, so if you like spells in Elden Ring, stay tuned for that coming up. Overall, I have learned a lot in the 100+ hours I've dueled people over the past few weeks. Way more than I can realistically fit in one video, but I wanted to highlight a few things that I think are the most important or maybe have the most impact on my gameplay. There are definitely other topics that have equal weight as the ones that I covered in this video, and that I will cover in future videos, such as panic rolling, stamina management, FP management, etc. The too long didn't watch here would be follow the rules, aka don't touch that crimson flask. Make sure you're at a comfortable poise level to prevent poise breaks. I'd say shoot for 161 plus. Try not to rely too heavily on active talismans if you aren't able to activate them quickly and easily. And last but not least, make sure that you are aware of your weapon's moveset and range for each move, as well as practicing positioning yourself around your opponent so that you're able to avoid their attack while getting in a couple of your own, or position yourself to roll catch them if you have the range. There are a ton of ways to play this game, and while there definitely are suboptimal PvP builds, those builds can both still teach you something and still be fun, even if they are potentially not competitive. Just by refining how you approach your duelist build and strategies in the ring, you can make a complete change on how you PvP. If you made it this far, thank you so much for spending your time with me. I won't get into it, but if you enjoyed this video and want to see more from my baby channel, then there's a nice shiny red button waiting to make all your hopes and dreams come true. I really hope this was helpful in some way, and I hope that you have a wonderful, wonderful week. I will see you next Sunday, or maybe I won't, and that's okay too. Either way, farewell, do take care, and happy dueling.